The year is 1989. The Berlin Wall is crashing down and the entire Soviet bloc is coming with it. In Dresden, East Germany, a frantic KGB lieutenant colonel is burning stacks of secret documents. Outside the gates of the KGB headquarters, an angry crowd is gathering. The same energy that tore down the wall is now aimed right at them. He makes a desperate call to a nearby Red Army tank unit, pleading for protection, for orders, for anything. The line is dead silent. Moscow isn't answering. In that single moment of abandonment, Putin learned a profound lesson. When central power gets weak, everything falls into chaos. This wasn't just a political event for him, it was a lesson burned into his mind. One day, he would make sure Moscow never stayed silent again. He was a man shaped in the shadows of the KGB, a quiet bureaucrat who dreamed of being a spy. From a forgotten outpost in East Germany, he watched an empire collapse and swore he'd never let his own country meet the same fate. This is the story of how Vladimir Putin used espionage, raw ambition, and political cunning to climb from total obscurity to the absolute pinnacle of power, reshaping Russia and the world in his image. Long before he was a world leader, Vladimir Putin was just a boy in Leningrad, obsessed with Soviet spy novels. He was captivated by movies like The Shield and the Sword, where one dedicated intelligence officer could do what entire armies couldn't. This romantic idea of being a spy became his singular goal. At just 15, he boldly walked into a local KGB office and asked how to join. He was told they didn't take walk-ins. The path, they said, was through the military or with a university degree. So, that's what he did. Putin focused all his energy on getting a law degree from Leningrad State University. He graduated in 1975 and, just like he'd planned, got an offer for a career assignment. He had finally made it. He was recruited into the KGB. His first years were spent in counterintelligence, learning the meticulous craft of spy work, recruiting sources, tracking foreigners, and mastering the tools of the trade. But he was stuck in his hometown of Leningrad, mostly keeping tabs on tourists and diplomats. It was a far cry from the high-stakes thrillers he grew up watching. He was a bureaucrat in a spy's world, just waiting for his big break. That break finally came in 1985. He got his first and only foreign assignment, Dresden, East Germany. It wasn't a glamorous post like Berlin, but it put him right on the front lines of the Cold War. As a liaison to the Stasi, the East German secret police, Putin's job was to recruit agents and gather whatever intelligence he could, all while living under the cover of being a translator. For 5 years, he watched the slow, steady decay of the communist government. Then came the fall of 1989. The chaos he saw and the powerlessness he felt as the mob surrounded his building left a scar he'd never forget. He saw with his own eyes how fast an authoritarian state could fall apart once it lost its grip. When he returned to Russia in 1990, the Soviet Union itself was dying. He officially resigned from the KGB in 1991, right as a coup against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was failing. The empire he had sworn to protect was gone, but the lessons he learned in the KGB, the need for absolute control, the danger of public dissent, and the power of patience, would become the very pillars of his political career. The Russia of the 1990s was pure chaos. The Soviet collapse left a power vacuum filled with economic ruin, political free-for-alls, and rampant crime. It was in this wild environment that Putin stepped into politics, taking a job as an advisor to his old law professor Anatoly Sobchak, who was now the mayor of St. Petersburg. Putin quickly got a reputation for being the quiet guy in the back of the room who could get anything done. He was the ultimate gray man, a bureaucrat who knew how to navigate the treacherous world of post-Soviet Russia. He became known as Sobchak's fixer. When his boss lost a re-election bid in 1996, Putin's connections got him a new job in Moscow, inside President Boris Yeltsin's administration. And that move would kickstart one of the fastest political climbs in modern history. Moscow in the late 90s was the heart of a weak, crumbling state. President Boris Yeltsin was in poor health, and the country was basically run by a new class of super-rich oligarchs. Yeltsin and his inner circle, nicknamed the Family, were desperate to find a successor who would protect them from rivals and make sure the transition of power was smooth. They needed someone loyal, capable, and most of all, tough. They found their man in Vladimir Putin. His rise was stunningly fast. In 1998, he was appointed head of the FSB, the new KGB. Then he became secretary of the powerful Security Council. By August 1999, Yeltsin made him prime minister and publicly named him as his chosen successor. To prove his strength, Putin immediately launched a brutal war in the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, projecting the image of a strongman leader that a weary public was craving. His approval ratings shot through the roof. Then, on New Year's Eve 1999, the final shocker. Boris Yeltsin announced he was resigning immediately, making Putin the acting president of Russia. One of the very first things he did was sign a decree giving Yeltsin and his family total immunity from prosecution. The loyal fixer had delivered. Less than 4 months later, in March 2000, Vladimir Putin was officially elected president, completing his journey from the shadows of the KGB to the throne of Russian power. As president, Putin got right to work consolidating his power, using all the lessons on control he'd mastered in the KGB. His first targets? The powerful oligarchs who had run the show during the Yeltsin years. He made them a simple deal. You can keep your money, but you stay out of politics. Those who didn't listen were made into examples. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man at the time, was arrested in 2003, and his massive oil company, Yukos, was torn apart. The message was brutal and clear. Loyalty to the Kremlin comes first. Putin centralized his power, shut down independent media, and started putting his old friends from the security services into key government roles. He was building a new power structure, a vertical of power, loyal only to him. He was rebuilding the strong, centralized state he was convinced Russia needed to survive, a state where all power flows from one place, the Kremlin. Originally, Putin couldn't be president forever due to constitutional term limits. So after 2 terms, he stepped aside in 2008 to become prime minister, while his hand-picked successor, Dmitry Medvedev, took the presidency. This tandem leadership was widely seen as a clever move to let Putin keep control without technically breaking the rules. In 2012, he returned to the presidency, this time for a newly extended 6-year term. But his most audacious move was still to come. In 2020, Putin pushed through a massive constitutional overhaul. One of the key changes was an amendment that reset his own presidential term count to 0. Just like that, he could run again in 2024 and 2030, potentially staying in power until 2036. He was re-elected in March 2024, securing another 6 years in a political landscape where there was no real opposition. The spy who once feared the collapse of state power had built a system to make sure his own power was practically permanent. Putin's journey is a powerful reminder of how one person's ambition can collide with history to reshape the world. If you like this breakdown, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the people defining our time. Let us know in the comments what part of Putin's rise you find most fascinating. From a boy dreaming of spy games in post-war Leningrad to the absolute master of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin's story is one of careful planning, strategic patience, and ruthless action. The KGB agent who watched the Soviet Union fall apart from a distance used his training not to serve an ideology, but to grab and hold on to power for himself. He saw chaos in the fall of the Berlin Wall and spent the next 30 years building a fortress of centralized control. He wanted to ensure that the silence he heard on the phone from Moscow back in 1989 would never, ever be repeated. In the process, he didn't just transform Russia, he remade it in his own image, a state defined by power, control, and the unbending will of one leader. The question that's left is what his legacy will be, and what the world looks like after the man from the KGB is finally gone.